When a U.S. aircraft carrier changes its position, the world does not see just a ship moving across the ocean. It witnesses a carefully choreographed signal of power. These floating cities are among the most visible symbols of American military dominance, and their movement is designed to communicate intent without firing a single shot. To allies, it sends reassurance that protection is close at hand. To rivals, it delivers a warning that force can be projected quickly and decisively. To financial markets and global institutions, it introduces uncertainty, speculation, and recalculation. This is the language of modern geopolitics, spoken not with words but with steel, radar, and runway decks stretching across the sea. Such deployments are never accidental. They are the product of strategic planning rooms, intelligence assessments, and political calculations. When tensions rise with Iran, the carrier's movement becomes part of a broader narrative of deterrence. It tells a story of readiness and dominance, but it also exposes a deeper reality. Global power today is increasingly performed through symbolic acts. The presence of a carrier is meant to create psychological pressure, shaping the behavior of other states before negotiations even begin. This transforms the ocean into a political stage where every maneuver is interpreted, analyzed, and amplified by media and governments alike. What is often ignored is how this signal reinforces a hierarchy of power. Only a handful of countries possess the ability to deploy such massive naval forces across continents. This creates an uneven global landscape where some nations command the seas while others must react to decisions made far beyond their borders. The carrier does not only represent military strength, it represents economic capacity, industrial infrastructure, and technological dominance. It reflects decades of investment into defense industries that thrive on geopolitical tension, turning security into a market and influence into a commodity. At the same time, this show of force reshapes diplomatic conversations. When a carrier arrives in a contested region, negotiations become framed by pressure rather than mutual trust. Diplomatic talks occur under the shadow of military power, narrowing the space for compromise and encouraging hardened positions. Smaller nations in the region are forced to recalibrate their alliances, sometimes choosing security guarantees over sovereignty, sometimes remaining silent to avoid becoming collateral in a larger power struggle. The media also plays a critical role in amplifying this signal. Dramatic footage of jets taking off from carrier decks and headlines declaring major moves transform strategic decisions into public spectacles. This spectacle reinforces the idea that security is synonymous with visible force, conditioning audiences to associate safety with military presence. Over time, this narrative becomes normalized, making constant deployments appear routine rather than exceptional. Ultimately, the movement of an aircraft carrier is not just a tactical decision, it is a political performance aimed at shaping global perception, reinforcing dominance, influencing allies and rivals, and maintaining a system where power is demonstrated through visibility and scale rather than cooperation and restraint. When tensions rise between the United States and Iran, the first battlefield is often not land or sea, but the global economy. Military escalation sends immediate signals to financial markets, energy traders, and shipping industries. The mere possibility of conflict in the Persian Gulf, a region that carries a significant share of the world's oil and gas exports, is enough to trigger price volatility. Fuel costs increase, transportation expenses rise, and inflationary pressure spreads across economies far removed from the Middle East. What begins as a geopolitical standoff quickly transforms into a daily economic burden for ordinary people who may have no connection to the conflict itself. Energy markets are especially sensitive to these developments. When aircraft carriers move closer to strategic waterways, traders anticipate potential disruptions, whether real or perceived. This anticipation drives speculation, and speculation drives price spikes. Governments may claim that these deployments are defensive, but markets react to risk, not rhetoric. For developing countries, higher oil prices can destabilize national budgets, weaken currencies, and force painful cuts to social programs. For industrialized nations, it means higher production costs and increased consumer prices, affecting everything from food supply chains to manufacturing output. Shipping and trade are also deeply affected. Insurance premiums for cargo vessels traveling through high risk zones increase dramatically during periods of military tension. These costs are passed down the supply chain, making imported goods more expensive and reducing profit margins for exporters. Ports slow down, routes are adjusted, and logistical uncertainty becomes the new normal. The result is a ripple effect that touches farmers waiting for fertilizer shipments, small businesses dependent on imported materials, and consumers facing rising prices on everyday products. At the same time, there is another side of the economic story that rarely receives equal attention. While many people absorb the negative consequences, certain sectors benefit enormously. Defense contractors see increased demand, arms manufacturers secure new contracts, and private security firms expand their operations. Financial institutions that specialize in defense investments experience growth, creating a system where economic incentives are tied to prolonged tension rather than resolution. This imbalance reveals a structural problem in how global security is financed and maintained. Governments often justify military deployments by emphasizing national security, but they rarely acknowledge the economic trade offs. Public funds are redirected toward military operations, maintenance of naval fleets, and regional deployments, diverting resources from education, healthcare, infrastructure, and social welfare. Taxpayers end up financing both the immediate costs of deployment and the long term consequences of economic instability. In this way, the economic consequences of escalation extend far beyond the battlefield, embedding themselves into household budgets, national policies, and global trade systems, turning geopolitical rivalry into a quiet but persistent financial strain that reshapes everyday life. Military posturing is not only about foreign policy, it is also about domestic politics. When leaders authorize high profile deployments, such as sending an aircraft carrier toward a tense region, they are often speaking to two audiences at once: the international community and their own citizens. At home, these actions are framed as decisive leadership, strength, and control. They create images of authority that can distract from internal economic challenges, social unrest, or declining public approval. In times of political uncertainty, external threats become convenient tools for unifying divided populations around a common narrative of national security. This strategy relies heavily on symbolism. A carrier strike group is visually powerful and emotionally charged. It conveys action, urgency, and dominance without requiring immediate conflict. Politicians understand the value of this imagery. Press conferences, official statements, and carefully timed announcements transform strategic decisions into political theater. The public is encouraged to see these moves as necessary and heroic, while deeper questions about long-term consequences and alternative approaches are pushed to the margins of public debate. Media coverage often reinforces this dynamic. News cycles favor dramatic developments, breaking alerts, and bold headlines. The complexity of diplomatic negotiations and economic consequences rarely receives the same attention as military maneuvers. As a result, audiences are conditioned to associate leadership with visible displays of force rather than patient diplomacy or structural reform. This creates a feedback loop in which politicians feel pressured to perform strength in order to maintain credibility, even when such actions may increase the risk of escalation. There is also a partisan dimension to military posturing. Different political groups may use foreign tensions to criticize opponents, accuse rivals of weakness, or justify aggressive policies. Defense spending becomes a political talking point, framed as patriotism rather than public investment. In this environment, questioning military deployments can be portrayed as unpatriotic or naive, narrowing the space for critical discussion and democratic oversight. This weakens the ability of citizens to hold leaders accountable for decisions that carry enormous financial and human costs. Beyond elections and public approval, there is the influence of powerful interest groups. Defense industries, lobbying organizations, and strategic think tanks often shape the narrative around security threats. Their analyses and recommendations frequently align with increased military spending and expanded deployments. When these voices dominate policy discussions, political leaders find it easier to justify aggressive postures while presenting them as expert-backed necessities rather than political choices. In this way, military posturing becomes deeply embedded in the political system, serving as both a tool of governance and a mechanism for maintaining power, blurring the line between genuine security concerns and strategic image management, and transforming foreign policy into a stage for domestic political performance. When the United States moves a major naval asset into a sensitive region, it does more than shift military balance. It reshapes the entire architecture of regional and global power. Allies interpret such actions as reassurance, a signal that protection and support remain firmly in place. Rival powers, on the other hand, see the same move as a challenge to their influence and an attempt to redraw strategic boundaries. This dual interpretation creates a tense environment in which every action is scrutinized and every response is carefully calculated. The result is a delicate and often unstable equilibrium built on deterrence rather than cooperation. In the Middle East, the presence of a U.S. aircraft carrier alters the dynamics among regional actors. Countries aligned with Washington may feel emboldened, strengthening their political positions and security strategies. Others may perceive the deployment as an imbalance of power that undermines regional autonomy. This can push some states to seek alternative alliances, deepen ties with rival global powers, or invest more heavily in their own military capabilities. Instead of reducing conflict, the concentration of external power can accelerate arms competition and heighten regional insecurity. On a global scale, these deployments also influence how major powers interact with one another. Nations such as China and Russia closely monitor U.S. military movements, not only in the Middle East, but across strategic waterways worldwide. Each deployment becomes part of a larger contest over influence, trade routes, and geopolitical prestige. This competition extends beyond military strength into technology, infrastructure investment, and diplomatic outreach. As great powers maneuver for advantage, smaller nations often find themselves caught in the middle, pressured to align with one side or another in order to secure economic or security benefits. For smaller states, neutrality becomes increasingly difficult to maintain. The presence of powerful naval forces near their borders or trade routes can limit their policy options. They may face diplomatic pressure, economic incentives, or security threats that force them into strategic partnerships they did not originally seek. This reduces their ability to pursue independent foreign policies and weakens the concept of regional self determination. Over time, this imbalance of influence reshapes political institutions and security frameworks across entire regions. There is also a psychological dimension to this power shift. Visible military presence reinforces perceptions of dominance and hierarchy in the international system. It sends a message about who has the capacity to act globally and who must react locally. This perception influences negotiations, trade agreements, and diplomatic interactions, often giving stronger powers an advantage before discussions even begin. In this way, a single carrier deployment becomes part of a much larger process that restructures alliances, intensifies global competition, and redefines the balance of power, turning regional tensions into interconnected struggles that extend far beyond the original point of conflict. True security cannot be measured solely by the number of ships at sea or the size of military budgets. While aircraft carriers and advanced weapon systems project strength, they do not address the deeper causes of conflict. Stability built only on force is fragile, dependent on constant escalation and permanent readiness for confrontation. A security strategy centered on military dominance often treats symptoms rather than causes, responding to crises without resolving the underlying political, economic, and social tensions that produce them in the first place. Diplomacy offers an alternative path that is frequently undervalued. Dialogue, negotiation, and multilateral cooperation require patience and political courage, yet they provide tools for managing disputes without resorting to force. When nations invest in diplomatic institutions and regional forums, they create channels for communication that reduce misunderstanding and miscalculation. These mechanisms allow conflicts to be addressed through compromise rather than confrontation, lowering the risk of sudden escalation that can spiral beyond control. Economic cooperation is another critical pillar of long-term security. Trade partnerships, development projects, and shared infrastructure create mutual dependencies that discourage conflict. When countries benefit from stable relationships, the cost of confrontation becomes higher than the cost of cooperation. Investments in education, technology exchange, and regional development programs can reduce inequality and unemployment, two factors that often fuel political instability and social unrest. By strengthening economic foundations, nations can build resilience that military power alone cannot provide. There is also the human dimension of security that is often overlooked. Communities affected by conflict experience displacement, poverty, and trauma that persist long after headlines fade. Addressing humanitarian needs, supporting refugees, and rebuilding war-torn areas are essential components of lasting peace. When these issues are ignored, resentment and desperation can create fertile ground for future violence. A security framework that prioritizes human well being recognizes that peace is not just the absence of war, but the presence of opportunity and dignity. Environmental and resource challenges further complicate the picture. Water scarcity, climate change, and food insecurity are increasingly becoming sources of tension between nations and regions. Military solutions offer little protection against rising temperatures or shrinking resources. Cooperative environmental policies, shared resource management, and global climate initiatives are necessary to prevent future conflicts rooted in ecological stress. By redefining security to include diplomacy, economic stability, humanitarian responsibility, and environmental sustainability, societies can move beyond the narrow logic of military dominance and toward a broader vision of peace that is built on cooperation, shared interests, and long-term global stability rather than constant preparation for war